Welcome to Calvary Baptist Church, Idaho Falls, where we seek to glorify God, make disciples, and take the gospel to the nations. For more information about our church, please visit www.calvaryidahofalls.org.
Have you ever wished that God spoke today like he did in the Bible? How cool would it be to come upon a burning bush? Like you're just hiking up here in the mountains and then you just come across this burning bush and it's, you're like Moses, right? The bush is burning, but it's not consumed. And then suddenly you hear this voice speaking to you from the bush and you are convinced beyond a shadow of a doubt that this is holy ground. I mean, you take off your shoes, you fall on your face, and God speaks to you directly. Wouldn't that be cool? Maybe it'd be scary, but wouldn't that be awesome? And you could walk away from that experience with no doubt that God has spoken and that you must obey. I'm here to encourage you this morning that the Bible is our burning bush. Every time you open this book, God speaks. So I want to encourage you this morning as we begin, as we open, to prepare your heart because this is holy ground. Whether you're in your car before work, looking at your phone, reading the Word, whether you're in the bathroom, wherever you are, whether you're in church, in Sunday school, every time you open the Bible and you read His Word, God is speaking to you. And so I pray that we will listen, knowing that God is speaking, and that we will obey this morning, and that we will be changed. So the background, if you haven't been with us in the last few weeks, is we are going through the Sermon on the Mount. This is Jesus' largest teaching in the Gospels that is all together. Jesus' sermon where he is declaring to us what it is like to be a part of the kingdom of God. And so Jesus has declared that he has not come to abolish the law. He's not come to remove the Old Testament, but he has come to fulfill it. But not just the law, but the prophets, that he has come to be the perfect priest, the perfect king, and the perfect prophet. Where everybody else has failed, Jesus is going to be our righteousness. But he is declaring to us what righteousness really looks like, what it looks like to truly be a part of the kingdom. And it's not simply external righteousness, it's not simply doing things outwardly, but it is an internal righteousness, a transformation that happens in your heart. And where he says, a few weeks ago, he told them, unless your righteousness exceeds that of the scribes and Pharisees, you will never enter the kingdom of heaven. And so Jesus begins these 6 examples of this. Last week, we looked at anger. He says, you've heard it said, do not murder. But I say, do not be angry with someone or you are liable to judgment. And so this week, we come to verse 27. He says, you have heard that it was said, you shall not commit adultery. But I say to you that everyone who looks at a woman with lustful intent has already committed adultery with her in his heart. If your right eye causes you to sin, tear it out and throw it away. For it is better for you to lose one of your members than your whole body be thrown into hell. And if your right hand causes you to sin, cut it off and throw it away. For it is better you to lose one of your members than your whole body to go into hell. So as we begin this passage this morning, looking at this, Jesus is saying, you understand the commandment, one of the 10 commandments, right? That you're not to commit adultery, to have sex outside of the confines that God has designed it, which is marriage. But Jesus says there's a greater law here, which says it's not just what you do outwardly, but it's what's going on in your head and in your heart. And so Jesus is declaring to us much more than just don't do it. Because the people that he would have been speaking to, the Jewish people, would have understood Jesus' intent and God's design for sexual desire. That's where I want to begin this morning. Before we even jump into what Jesus is saying for us not to do and for us how to respond and where the gospel meets us, we need to understand this morning God's design for sexual desire. You need to teach your children God's design and desire of what sexual desire, how all of that works. Our culture is preaching something very destructive. Right? And so it's not just good enough for us to say, don't do that. People need to know the why. And the Bible gives us the why. It gives us what God has designed and how it's supposed to work together. So flip all the way back. First page of the Bible. Not the content page. It's Genesis chapter 1. Genesis chapter 1, verses 27 and 28. So God created man in his own image. In the image of God, he created him. Male and female, he created them. And God blessed them. And God said to them, be fruitful and multiply and fill the earth and subdue it and have dominion over the fish of the sea and over the birds of the heavens and over every living thing that moves on the earth. Flip over one page, Genesis chapter 2, verses 24 and 25. It says, therefore a man shall leave his father and mother and hold fast to his wife, and they shall become one flesh. The man and his wife were both naked, and they were not ashamed. This is God's good design. God's design for sexual desire is that it take place in a marriage between a man and a woman. That is the only place that God has given us for sexual desire to be fulfilled, for it to happen. Everything outside of that is sin. Now, that's not what the world says. The world says if you feel, you want it, you desire it, you think it, you do it. God says there is a design, and when you step outside of God's design, there is brokenness, and there is pain, and there is hurt. There may be pleasure for a moment, but it is momentary, and it is short, and what you will reap is destruction. What you will reap is brokenness. What you will reap is guilt and shame. No matter how hard you try to run from it, it will happen. You say, well, Matt, that's all great and good. I like that God has designed it this way, and this is the way it's supposed to work. But I just tell you, this thing of a man standing before his wife and the naked and no shame, that's not how the world works. That's not how even my marriage works. And that's true because you and I do not live in a Genesis 2 world. We live in a Genesis 3 world where sin and rebellion has already happened. So look at Genesis chapter 3, verses 6 and 7. It says, so when the woman saw that the tree was good for food, and that it was a delight to the eyes, and that the tree was to be desired to make one wise, she took its fruit and she ate, and she also gave some to her husband who was with her, and he ate. And the eyes of both of them were opened, and they knew they were naked, and they sewed fig leaves together and made themselves loincloths. This is where shame, this is where guilt, this is where sin has entered the picture. And it is distorted and disrupted and broken God's design for us. Not just for sex, but for everything. And I want you to notice here in Genesis chapter 3 that the first time that people lusted, it wasn't after each other. What was the lust? The lust was if you eat this fruit, and it wasn't even after the fruit. It was that if you eat this fruit, you will be like God. First and foremost, folks, when we lust after anything, it is a rebellion against God. It is saying, God, you have not given me what I need. I want this. I'm not satisfied with what you've given me, with what you blessed me with. I want that. And so we have to understand the context of all of this, that God's design is good, that God's design for sexual desire is good. But when we step outside of that, there is brokenness, there is pain, and there is shame. And that's what happened. Adam and Eve ate the fruit, and suddenly they realized they were naked. Suddenly. Two people, the only two people there are, and suddenly they run from each other. They hide from each other, and they hide from God. And we have been experiencing the ramifications of that sin and our own sin since the day we were born. Sexual pleasure, satisfaction, fulfillment is a byproduct of obedience, not the purpose. Did you hear that this morning? Let me say it one more time. Sexual pleasure, satisfaction, and fulfillment is a byproduct of obedience, not the purpose. What was God's design and purpose for sex? Multiplication. That there would be more people. That they would fill the earth and glorify His name. Now, God made it fun. I mean, there's no way around that. God made it fun, right? God made it pleasurable. God made it good inside the context of marriage between a husband and a wife who give themselves to each other. The two become one flesh. That's God's design. That's God's purpose. That's the way it's supposed to work. But it's not for the purpose of just fulfilling your desires. You see, our culture has taken a byproduct and made it the point, made it the purpose. And that's why we're broken, and that's why we're confused, and that's why we're not satisfied, because God never designed sex to be the point. And so when we make it the point, when we make it the purpose for why we get up, then that's why we get all of these perversions, because it never satisfies, it never works. And so people say, well, I must be doing it wrong. So maybe I need to do it with someone else. And so they stray outside of the bounds of marriage. Or maybe I need to try my own sex. Or maybe I need to become a girl or become a boy. And all of these perversions that we see in our culture are a byproduct of not putting sexual desire in the confines of which God designed it. See, this is much bigger than just don't do it. We've got to understand God's design, God's purpose, and God's plan. Our ultimate joy and satisfaction is found in our relationship with God through Jesus Christ, not in sex. And I want you to show you this because this is important. Look with me in the New Testament. And I want you to think about the Apostle Paul, and I want you to think about Jesus. The Apostle Paul talks about in 1 Corinthians chapter 7, verse 7 through 9, he talks about the gift of singleness. And if you're single in here this morning and you may be over 30, you may not think that singleness is a gift. You may think it's a curse. You may not like it. But the reality is the Bible describes it as a gift. This is what the Apostle Paul says. 1 Corinthians chapter 7, 7 through 9. I wish that all were as myself am. But each of you has his own gift from God. One of one kind and one of another. And then he says, to the unmarried and the widows, I say that it is good for them to remain single as I am. But if they cannot exercise self-control, they should marry, for it is better to marry than to burn with passion. So how in the world could Apostle Paul say it's good to be single? It is a gift of God to be single. Now, that's probably not the gift for most of us in this room or most of the people that are growing up. Why? Because we still need to multiply. That's God's purpose. And if everybody was single, that wouldn't work. But God can't give the gift of singleness if sex is the most important thing in the world. It doesn't make any sense. Think about Jesus. Jesus was single. Jesus never got married. Jesus never had sex. But yet Jesus was perfectly righteous and perfectly whole. And if you need sex to be fulfilled, then Jesus wasn't fulfilled. But we know that Jesus was fulfilled. Right? That he was perfectly joyful, perfectly content. Right? This is God's design. It works. Apostle Paul goes on, just so you're not feeling like you messed up this morning. 1 Corinthians chapter 7, verse 28. But if you do marry, you have not sinned. Everybody goes, phew. And if a betrothed woman marries, she has not sinned, yet those who marry will have worldly troubles. Everybody say amen. And I want to spare you that. Right? This is what Paul says. He says, look, this is God's design, but folks, we're not living in Genesis 2 world, we're living in Genesis 3 world, and where two people come together, there's going to be problems. 1 Corinthians 7, 32, 35. This is what he says. I want you to be free from anxieties. The unmarried man is anxious about things of the Lord, how to please the Lord. But the married man is anxious about worldly things, how to please his wife. And his interests are divided. And the unmarried or the betrothed woman is anxious about the things of the Lord, about how to be holy, body and spirit. But the married woman is anxious about worldly things, how to please her husband. I say this for your own benefit, not to lay a restraint upon you, but to promote good order and secure your undivided devotion to the Lord. Paul says, listen, God's design is good, but trying to live God's design in a broken world is hard. And if you can remain single, remain single. It is a gift of God. But if you marry, that's awesome. That's good. You're just going to have issues. Right? Let's just be honest. That's what he's saying. And one of those issues is what Jesus is addressing right here. Now, you're going to have a problem with lust, whether you're single or married. But some of the young people in this room, you're thinking, man, if I get married, then all that, unnatural desire, that stuff it's just going to go away. Well, it doesn't. Marriage is not the fixer of what's broken on inside of you. Remember, marriage is external. It's one of those things, right? It doesn't fix if there's something broken in you. All right, so let's look again. Matthew chapter 5, verse 27. You have heard that it was said, you shall not commit adultery. But I say to you that everyone who looks at a woman with lustful intent has already committed adultery with her in his heart. What Jesus is talking about here is the destructive lie of lust. Lust is an internal desire that can often be concealed, maybe even for a really long time. You can fool yourself, you can fool other people, but you can't fool God. But the reality is, even if it's hidden, it is destroying your soul. So let's look at this specifically. This word looks, right, that it is translated here, looks. But I say to you, anyone who looks at a woman with lustful intent, right, it's the Greek word blepon, which is a present tense participle. Now, why is that important? Because it's not saying that just seeing something with your eyes is sinful. It's saying that if you continue to look and you add the thought to the looking, that's when lust happens. Right? So, if you just happen to go to the beach one day and you realize, oh, man, this is the top of beach. I shouldn't be here, right? Or somebody just made it one, right? And you saw, right? And they're just doing what, just the seeing, that's not lust. But it's the thinking, it's the dwelling. That's what Jesus is talking about here. Right? You don't have to walk around this world with a blindfold on. But we do have to guard our heart and what we think and how we think. And folks, we need to seriously understand the destructive tools of lust that Satan uses to bind us and destroy us. Now, everybody in here knows that pornography is a horrible thing. And if you don't know, it is. It is a plague of devastating proportions upon our culture and our world. It is a grievous evil that leads to many other grievous evils. Things like sex trafficking and sex slavery are all funded and fueled by pornography. And we're not going to dwell on this a real long time, because if you're stuck in that this morning, you know it. And you know how bad it is. You know how much shame you feel, how much guilt is overwhelming you this morning. But I want to remind you that this is a tool that Satan is using to destroy your life and to destroy your soul. It's not benign. It's not okay. it's not something everybody does. Or if it is something everybody does, it doesn't matter. It's still brokenness. And if this was 10 or 20 years ago, this sermon this morning would probably be only to men. But the reality is, statistics say that this is an increasingly, desperately growing problem, even for women. That in its evil design, people who create pornography have figured out what wires women's brains, what does that, and they have tailor-made it to suck you in as well. And it is destructive, and it is damning, and it's harmful. And you know that if you're caught up in it this morning. But it's not the only tool, right? But why is pornography so difficult, and why is it so much more devastating than it was 20, 30, 40, 50 years ago? It's always existed. And look, it probably existed in some form even in Jesus' day. But people didn't have cell phones back then. They didn't have stacks of porn magazines just laying around in their pocket. Videos, right, in their pocket, easily accessible. You know, folks, I mean, cocaine is a bad thing, but cocaine epidemic became really bad when they made crack. Why? Because it was cheap and it was easy to distribute. That's what pornography is today. When it's on your phone, it's in your pocket, it's cheap, and it's easy to access, and it is so destructive. And if you have kids, you have teenagers, you need to know what they're looking at on their phone. Not just so you can be the parent, but because it is deadly for them. And it's not just a problem when you're a teenager, it will affect them the rest of their lives. But it's not just pornography, it's also fantasy novels, right? It's Netflix and chill culture. If you don't know what that is, don't worry about it. It's movies. And maybe even this. Maybe it's Facebook and Instagram. Man, wow. My girlfriend in high school still looks good in a bathing suit. Just scrolling through, seeing those images, thinking about those things. Folks, adultery doesn't just start. There's a process. Outward sin doesn't just happen. There's a process. And how does it start? It starts on the inside. It starts with lust. It starts with all of these seeds that we have planted that lead to all kinds of brokenness and pain. Lies, lies, and more lies. That's what lust is. It is the same thing that Adam and Eve bought into. Right? This is going to make you wise. This is going to fix your life. This is going to be the most amazing pleasure you've ever known. This is going to make you like God. No more restrictions. No more labels. Nothing. Just do what you want to do. And then you find yourself smack dab in a broken pit of shame and hurt and fear. And what do I do? What do I do? We're eating rocks and choking on sand. And we're okay with it. And Jesus said it's not okay. It's not okay. In fact, Jesus says that we should fight against this sin with extreme prejudice. Verse 29, what does he say? If your right eye causes you to sin, tear it out and throw it away. Whoa, hey. For it is better that you lose one of your members than your whole body be thrown into hell. And if your right hand causes you to sin, cut it off and throw it away. For it is better for you to lose one of your members than your whole body to go into hell. He says it twice. He's talking about the ultimate consequences of sin. Sexual sin is hell, separated from God for all eternity. And he says, this is not some small little thing that's just okay. He said, you've got to take extreme measures. Now, I can see from us in this room that either we think Jesus is using hyperbole here or we just are not obedient people. Because most of you have two hands and two eyes. Doesn't mean we've never lusted. But Jesus here is not promoting the maiming of the individual. But what Jesus is doing is he's highlighting the seriousness and destructive nature of lust, that you need to take action immediately to remove whatever it is that is causing the problem. If it's your phone, get a dumb phone. not a smartphone. Get a flip phone. If it's your TV, cut off your cable. If it's your internet, get rid of your Wi-Fi. You say, well, that's kind of drastic. Well, I think cutting off your arm and plucking out your eye is kind of drastic. Which one do you want? Jesus said, you've got to be willing to do whatever is necessary to fight this disease, this destructive force that is unleashed in your life. You see, we often convince ourselves that sin is no big deal. And if we're a Christian, we just say, by the way, I'm already forgiven. I'm good. But you don't feel forgiven. If you're caught in this trap this morning, you don't feel forgiven. You feel dirty. You feel ashamed. And so what we bought into is cheap grace that doesn't offer real forgiveness. And we're just wallowing around in this brokenness and sin with no way out. The reason Jesus talks about the right hand and the right eyes in antiquity, the right side was considered more important than the left. Right? And even in some cultures in the Middle East, you don't do anything polite with your left hand. Right? Because that's the hand that you wipe with, okay? Just to be real technical about it. You don't shake hands with your left hand. Right? You don't pick up utensils with your left hand. You don't do any of that kind of stuff, right? You use your right hand. You shake somebody's hand with your right. You eat with your right. All of that, right? And so Jesus is saying this is so drastic, this is so important that you would cut off your right hand and only have your left and suffer the shame of that versus the internal brokenness that lust brings. And what Jesus is also highlighting here is how sexual sin is different from other sin. Right? You say, well, I thought all sins were the same. Well, the consequences of all sin are the same. Right? The ultimate consequence, which is separation from God and hell. But the present tense consequences of sexual sin are greater than most. This is what it says in 1 Corinthians chapter 6, verses 13 through 20. The body is not meant for sexual immorality, but for the Lord, and the Lord for the body. And God raised the Lord and will also raise us up by his power. Do you not know that your bodies are members of Christ? Shall then I take the members of Christ and make them members of a prostitute? Never. Or do you not know that he who is joined to a prostitute becomes one in body with her? For it is written, the two will become one flesh. But he who is joined to the Lord becomes one with him. Flee sexual immorality. Every other sin a person commits is outside the body, but the sexually immoral person sins against his own body. Now that's whether it's external or whether it's internal. So folks, you say, well, I've never been to a prostitute. But if you're knee-deep in pornography, you are lusting after someone you don't even know. Exactly the same as going to a prostitute. That's the seriousness of this. And I hate to be this direct this morning, but Jesus is this direct. So what do we do? How do we respond? If this is where we are this morning, if this is the brokenness that we're experiencing this morning, or if we know someone that is suffering from this, that is hurting over this, that is desperately caught in the midst of this, what do we do? Well, we come to Jesus. Right? It's our gospel hope in Jesus Christ. Last week we looked at the three circles, and we're going to look at this again because it's so important to remember and understand God's design is the first circle. Can you put that up there, Phil? God's design for sexual desire is marriage. That's the purpose. That's the plan. That's how he's made it to work. Well, what have we done? We said, well, I don't like that. Right? That's too confining. That's too restricting. I want to do what I want to do, so we've sinned. We've rebelled against God, and now we've landed right smack dab in the midst of brokenness. And whether it's anger or whether it's lust or whether it's both, right, we find ourselves in the midst of this. And you may say, well, I'm already a follower of Jesus. I'm here this morning. I mean, I just stood a while ago and sang these songs, and I'm trying to worship God. But folks, here, if you are stuck in the midst of the sin, you can't really worship and you can't really enjoy. Because you've got to repent. You've got to turn. Right? You've got to turn away from the sin and to Christ. He is the hope. And you've got to believe this morning that Jesus is more powerful than your lust. You've got to believe this morning that Jesus is powerful enough to pull you up out of your pornography addiction, out of your fantasy novel addiction, out of your movie addiction, whatever it is that is causing you to sin. Jesus has power over it. It may not feel like that this morning, but if you're willing to lay that down and to call upon the Lord, He will heal you. And it may be a process. But folks, I want to tell you this morning that one of the greatest tools that Satan has, especially with sexual sin, is secrecy. When no one knows, you're always going to be ashamed. And I'm not just talking about praying to God, because still no one knows. You say, well, God knows. Well, He does know. But God has put you in a church. He has put you in a body. He has surrounded you with people that love you. And I'm not saying you got to get up on this stage with a microphone and tell everybody what your issue is, but you need to tell somebody. You need to have somebody you know that you trust that will love you enough to walk by you with this. Right? And if you say it out loud, you destroy the weapon that Satan has over you, the secrecy, the shame. You remove it completely. And now you have an asset, a brother or a sister in Christ who can walk beside you and help you in the midst of this. So we turn from our sin, we turn to Jesus, and then what happens? We're forgiven. We're restored to God's design and God's purpose. That's the way this works. So wherever you are this morning, whatever is going on in your life, trust Jesus this morning. He is our hope. He is your way out. He is your peace.